We need to talk. About what? Is something wrong? We'll explain. Please, come with us.
I want you to imagine waking up on a Monday morning. Normal alarm. Normal coffee. Normal commute. You tie your tie in the bathroom mirror the same way you have for 11 years. You grab your keys off the hook by the door. You kiss your wife on the cheek, or maybe you don't, maybe things haven't been that warm between you two for a while, and you get in your car and you drive to work like it's any other day. Because as far as you know, it is. As far as you know, the biggest problem you're carrying into that building is a quarterly report that isn't finished and a meeting you're not prepared for. That's all. That's the whole weight of your morning. And then you step off the elevator. And two detectives are standing at your office door. And one of them looks you directly in the eye. And he says 4 words that will split your life into a before and an after. He says, "We need to talk." I had been having an affair with my colleague for 8 months. I thought it was our secret. I thought no one knew. I thought the hardest part would be the guilt, and I had plenty of that. I thought the worst thing that could happen was that my wife would find out. I was wrong about all of it. By the end of this story, someone will be dead. A marriage will be destroyed. A career will be in ashes. And I will be sitting across a table from a homicide detective trying to explain something that sounds guilty no matter how you say it. The truth came out. But not before it nearly buried me first. Stay with me. Because nothing about this story goes the way you think it will. Not one single part of it. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because if this story is anything to go by, you're going to want to be here for what comes next. My name is Darius. Darius Campbell. And at the time all of this happened, I was 39 years old, living in a mid-sized city in Ontario, Canada, working as a senior project manager at a mid-level financial services firm. Not the kind of place that makes headlines. Not the kind of place where anything particularly dramatic happens. People came in, drank bad coffee, sat in too many meetings, complained about their commute, and went home. That was the rhythm of it. That was the heartbeat of that building for years before any of this. I had been with the company for 11 years. I had worked my way up from entry-level analyst to the kind of role where people actually listened when I spoke in a room. I had a good reputation. I was known as someone who delivered. Someone who didn't make waves. Someone steady. I had earned that reputation slowly and carefully over more than a decade, and I was proud of it. I want you to understand that, because everything that followed was built on the foundation of what I had become in that office. And everything that followed also dismantled it completely. My wife's name is Renee. Renee Mark. And she was, and still is, one of the most remarkable women I have ever known. We met in our mid-20s at a mutual friend's birthday gathering in downtown Toronto. She was laughing at something across the room when I first saw her, and I remember thinking that I had never seen someone look so completely at home in their own skin. We dated for 2 years, got married at 30, bought a house in Mississauga at 32, and spent the next several years building what I can only describe as a genuinely good life. There was no dramatic falling apart. No explosive fights. No single moment I could point to and say, that was where we went wrong. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of slow drift that happens between two people who are both working hard, both tired, both giving everything they have to the external world and coming home with whatever is left. Which, over time, was not very much. We loved each other. I want to be clear about that. But somewhere in the middle of our 30s, we had stopped being curious about each other. And I think, if I am going to be truly honest about everything, that gap, that quiet emotional distance, is the thing that made me vulnerable to what happened next. Her name was Simone. Simone Maxwell. And she joined our firm about 14 months before everything collapsed. She came from a competing company in the same sector, brought in specifically to strengthen the analytics division, which had been underperforming for about 2 years. She was 34, sharp, and from the very first week she made it obvious that she had not come to coast. She asked better questions in her first month than most people asked in a year. She read everything. She challenged assumptions, politely, precisely, in a way that made you feel like you were being invited into a better way of thinking rather than corrected. She had this quality that I don't know how else to describe other than clarity. She was just clear. In her thinking, in her communication, in the way she moved through that office. She didn't perform confidence. She just had it. And I noticed. Everyone noticed. But I noticed in a way that I should have recognized as a warning sign and didn't. We became friends over the first few months, in the way that colleagues become friends when they work closely and respect each other. Long working lunches. Late conversations after team meetings wound down. The kind of friendship that is built on professional admiration and then slowly, quietly, becomes something more personal. She talked about her life outside the office. She had grown up partly in the Caribbean and partly in Brampton, had gone to school in the UK before returning to Canada, and carried all of those worlds in her at once. She was funny in a way that caught you off guard, a dry, observational humor that she deployed at precisely the right moment. I found myself looking forward to our interactions in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. And I told myself that was fine. That it was just friendship. That two professionals could be close without it meaning anything beyond what it appeared to be. I told myself that story for about 4 months before I stopped believing it. I am not going to stand here, or sit here, or wherever this narrator is in your imagination, and pretend that what happened between Simone and me was something that just occurred without choices being made. We made choices. Both of us. She was also married. Her husband's name was Trevor. Trevor Maxwell. They had been together for 6 years, married for 3 of those, and from what she shared with me, which I understood even at the time was only one side of a much larger story, things between them had been difficult for a while. He was in a different industry, property development, and worked long, irregular hours. She described him as someone who was present in the house but absent in every way that mattered. I listened to that and I nodded and I recognized the feeling, and somewhere in that recognition, the line between empathy and intimacy got crossed. That is the most honest accounting I can give you. It wasn't a grand passion that swept us both off our feet. It was 2 people who were lonely in their marriages and found each other in the space that loneliness creates. The affair began on a Thursday evening in late October. We had stayed late to finalize a client presentation that was due the following morning. Everyone else on the team had gone home. The office was quiet in the particular way that office buildings get quiet after hours, the ventilation humming, the city lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sense of the whole building exhaling. We were sitting across from each other at the long conference table on the 14th floor, surrounded by printed slide decks and cold coffee, and at some point the conversation stopped being about the presentation entirely. I don't remember exactly how it happened. That sounds like a convenient thing to say, but I mean it literally. There was no single moment, no dramatic declaration. There was a conversation that became something else, and then there was a decision, and then there were consequences that neither of us had fully mapped out. By the time I drove home that night it was past 11. Renee was already asleep. I stood in the bathroom for a long time looking at the same mirror I had looked at that morning, and I knew that something had shifted that could not be shifted back. What followed was 8 months of the most careful, disciplined, and ultimately self-deceiving behavior I have ever engaged in. We were meticulous. We communicated only through an encrypted messaging app that auto-deleted conversations every 24 hours. We never arrived at or left events together. We maintained strict professional distance in meetings and group settings. If anything, we were slightly cooler toward each other in public than we were to other colleagues, a deliberate overcorrection that in hindsight may have been more conspicuous than naturalness would have been. We varied where we met. We kept separate schedules. I told myself that this level of caution meant we were being responsible, which is perhaps the most spectacular piece of self-deception available to a person in that situation, the idea that conducting an affair carefully is somehow a form of integrity. There were moments during those 8 months when I almost ended it. Not because I wanted to, that is the part that shames me most in retrospect, but because the weight of it was starting to show up in places I couldn't control. I was sleeping badly. I was distracted in meetings. Renee asked me twice if everything was all right and I said yes, just work pressure, and she accepted that because it was plausible and because she trusted me and because she had no reason not to. That trust, which I had spent 11 years earning, I was spending in secret on something she knew nothing about. I understood all of this. I understood it and I continued anyway. And I want to be honest about that because this story doesn't work, it doesn't mean anything, if I try to position myself as a helpless participant in my own choices. The first sign that something was wrong, not wrong with us, but wrong in a larger sense, a more dangerous sense, came in month 6. It was a Monday morning and Simone came in looking like she hadn't slept. Not just tired. Something more specific than tired. She sat through the morning stand-up without saying a single word, which was so unlike her that 2 other people on the team noticed and mentioned it to me separately. When I found a moment to speak with her alone, she told me that Trevor had gone through her personal laptop over the weekend. She said he hadn't found anything concrete, the app we used left no trace, but that he had found a series of search history items and a pattern of late evenings that he had apparently been cataloging quietly for some time. She said the conversation that followed had been, her word, frightening. Not physically, but in tone. In the particular coldness of it. She said he had sat across from her at their kitchen table and spoken to her in a voice she had never heard from him before. Measured. Flat. Like he had already decided something and was simply informing her of it. I asked her what she meant by decided something. She said she wasn't sure. She said he had ended the conversation by going to bed as if nothing had happened, and that the silence the next morning had been worse than anything he could have said. I told her to be careful. She told me she knew how to handle her marriage. I accepted that and I should not have. I should have recognized that what she was describing was not the behavior of a man who was simply suspicious. It was the behavior of a man who was no longer asking questions. A man who had moved past uncertainty into something else entirely. But I didn't have the framework for that at the time, or if I did, I didn't want to apply it. We are remarkably good at not seeing the things we don't want to see. Month 7 brought a change in Simone that I felt before I could name it. She became harder to reach, not in a logistical sense, but emotionally. The conversations that had always been effortless started carrying a weight to them. She canceled plans twice in the same week with explanations that were technically plausible and somehow felt thin. I told myself it was the pressure of the relationship, the difficulty of sustaining something secret over such a long period. I told myself people went through phases and this was one of them. I told myself a great many things that kept me from asking the question I should have been asking, which was, what is actually happening in that house? Month 8. The month everything stopped. I had not spoken to Simone in 11 days, which had never happened, not once in 8 months. The encrypted app showed my last message as delivered and unread. She had been present at work but unreachable in every other sense. Professional. Polite. The kind of professional polite that is so deliberate it communicates everything it is trying not to say. I did not push. I told myself I was giving her space. I was actually giving myself permission not to deal with something I was afraid to look at directly. On the Wednesday of that week she stayed late. I saw the light on in her office when I left at 7. I thought about stopping. I kept walking. I got to the parking garage and I sat in my car for several minutes and then I went back inside. Not to see her. I want to be precise about this because it mattered enormously later. I had forgotten my phone charger on my desk. I went back in through the parking garage entrance, took the elevator to the 14th floor, retrieved my charger, and left. I was in the building for 11 minutes. The security system logged me in and out. I did not see Simone. I did not go near her office. I went home, got into bed, and fell asleep not knowing that in a matter of hours, everything would change. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching this who has ever been in a situation where their private life was about to collide with their public one. There is a specific kind of fear that exists in that space. It is not the fear of getting caught, exactly. It is the fear of being seen completely, of having every corner of yourself illuminated at once, including the corners you have never let anyone into, including yourself. That fear does what fear always does. It makes you still when you should move. It makes you silent when you should speak. It makes you calculate when you should simply be honest. And sometimes that calculation, that instinct to protect yourself in the moment, becomes the very thing that makes everything worse. I am telling you that now because it explains what I did next. And what I did next almost cost me everything. Wednesday night I slept. Thursday morning I drove to work. I stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor and immediately knew something was wrong. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. In a quiet, nauseating way. People were standing in the hallway in small clusters, speaking in low voices, and the ordinary morning energy of that office, the movement, the noise, the purposefulness, was completely absent. Someone was on the phone with their hand over their mouth. The door to the east stairwell was propped open with a chair in a way that it never was. I asked a colleague who was standing nearby what was happening. She looked at me with an expression I could not fully read and she said, "It's Simone. They found her this morning." I did not understand at first. Found her. What does that mean, found her? She worked here. She was here every day. And then I saw the police officer standing outside the stairwell door and the second officer at the far end of the hallway, and I understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives as a physical sensation before it reaches the mind. Simone Maxwell had been found at the bottom of the east stairwell at 7:14 in the morning by a building maintenance worker who had come in early to replace a faulty light panel. She was 34 years old. The initial assessment would describe it as a fall. The subsequent forensic analysis would raise questions about whether a fall was the complete story. And somewhere in the space between those two things, between fall and not a fall, my 11 minutes in that building the night before were about to become the most important 11 minutes of my life. I stood in that hallway and I felt the floor move underneath me. I am not speaking metaphorically. I reached out and steadied myself against the wall and I stood there for what felt like a very long time, probably 30 seconds, while the world reorganized itself around this new and terrible fact. And then I did the thing I will spend a long time regretting. I went to my desk. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I did not tell anyone that I had been in that building the previous night. I did not go to the police officer and identify myself. I did not call anyone. I sat at my desk and I pulled up a spreadsheet and I stared at it without seeing it while the sounds of an active police investigation filled the hallway outside my office. I told myself I was waiting for more information. I told myself I didn't know what had happened yet and it would be premature to say anything. I told myself all of the things that a frightened person tells themselves when the truth is simpler and more damaging. I was scared. I was scared of what it would look like. Scared of the affair coming out. Scared of being connected to something I had nothing to do with. And that fear, which was entirely about self-protection, made me look exactly like someone who had something to hide. Because I did have something to hide. Just not what they would come to suspect. By Thursday afternoon, the office had been asked to operate under limited capacity while investigators worked the scene. We were told that detectives would be speaking with staff members over the coming days. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen while Renee made dinner and talked about her day and I responded in approximately the right places without hearing any of it. I did not tell her what had happened. I did not tell her what I knew. I went to bed and I did not sleep and I lay there in the dark next to my wife, who had no idea that the life she thought she was living had already begun to come apart. Friday morning. I arrived at the office to find two men in the lobby that I had not seen before. They identified themselves to the receptionist as detectives. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button for 14, and stood there while the doors closed, and I thought, they are going to find the security footage. They are going to see the 11 minutes. And I am going to have to explain it. And to explain the 11 minutes, I am going to have to explain everything else. I had 22 floors of elevator ride to decide how I was going to handle that. I did not reach a decision before the doors opened. I walked to my office. I sat down. And 40 minutes later, they were standing in my doorway. "We need to talk," said the taller of the two. His name, I would learn, was Detective Sergeant Paul Fontaine, and he had been with the Homicide Division of the Regional Police Service for 16 years. His partner was Detective Constable Naomi Tremblay, and she was quieter in a way that I would later understand was completely intentional. They sat across from me in my office with the door closed and they were calm and professional and almost friendly, which as I said earlier is the most unsettling thing possible from a homicide detective, because you understand that the friendliness is not personal warmth, it is a tool, and it is being used with precision. They asked me how well I knew Simone Maxwell. I said we were colleagues. Friends. We worked closely on a number of projects together over the past year. They asked if I was aware of any difficulties she had been experiencing, personal, professional, anything she might have mentioned. I said no, nothing specific. They asked about my whereabouts on Wednesday evening. I told them I had left the office at 7 p.m. Which was true. I did not tell them about the return. I answered every other question they asked me that morning, and the one thing I chose not to say was the one thing that the security system had already recorded in exact detail. When they left my office that morning, I sat very still for a long time and thought about what I had just done. The second interview happened on Monday. It was no longer in my office. It was at the police station, in a room that was exactly as described by every person who has ever sat in one: plain walls, a table, chairs that were not quite comfortable, fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly overexposed quality. Fontaine and Tremblay came in together, and this time Tremblay had a notebook open from the moment she sat down. Fontaine started the same way, friendly, patient, like we were simply continuing a conversation from the week before. And then about 12 minutes in, he said, "The building security system shows you re-entering the premises on Wednesday at 9:47 p.m. and departing at 9:58 p.m. Can you walk us through that for us?" And there it was. The 11 minutes. On the table between us, unavoidable. I told them the truth. I had forgotten my phone charger. I went back to retrieve it. I was in the building for 11 minutes and I went directly to my desk and directly back out. What I had not told them in the first interview, and what I told them now, sitting in that room with no desk between us and no professional context to retreat into, was everything else. The affair. 8 months of it. The encrypted messages. The deleted conversations. The fact that her husband had become suspicious. The conversation she had described to me in month 6, the flat, cold voice across the kitchen table. The change in her behavior in month 7. The 11 days of silence in month 8. I watched Fontaine's pen slow on the notepad. I watched Tremblay, who had been writing steadily, stop writing entirely and look up at me for the first time since we had sat down. And she said, "Tell us more about the husband." Trevor Maxwell. I had never met him in person. I knew him through Simone's descriptions of him, which I understood even then were filtered through the particular lens of a marriage in difficulty. He was 41. He had built a reasonably successful property development business over the previous decade. He was, by Simone's account, a man who cared deeply about how things appeared: the house, the cars, the dinner parties, the image of a life that was working. She had said, more than once, that the version of her he seemed most committed to was the version that made his life look a certain way. I had filed that away as the kind of thing people say about a difficult spouse without fully interrogating whether I was getting a complete picture. I was not in a position to interrogate it objectively. I had my own interest in believing a particular version of her marriage. What the investigation uncovered about Trevor Maxwell came out over the following weeks, piece by piece, in the way that investigations surface information, not all at once, not in a narrative arc, but in fragments that slowly accumulate into a shape. The first thing that became known publicly was that security footage from the building showed Trevor Maxwell entering the premises on not 2 occasions, as Simone had told me, but 4. On 2 of those occasions he had accessed floors that had no connection to his wife's work or to any meeting or appointment that could be verified. One of those floors was the 14th. The timestamps placed those visits in the 3 weeks immediately preceding Simone's death. The investigators also obtained records from his vehicle's GPS system, which showed a pattern of visits to the area around the building during evening hours over a period of approximately 6 weeks. He had been watching. Not casually. Systematically. Simone's personal phone, recovered from her desk by investigators the morning her body was found, contained a series of text messages from Trevor sent the evening before her death. I was not shown the content of those messages directly. I am not law enforcement and this was not my case, but I was informed, in the context of my own interview process, that the final message in that sequence had been characterized by investigators as threatening in its language. Not ambiguously uncomfortable. Threatening. Specifically threatening. The message had been sent at 8:43 p.m. on Wednesday evening. The building security log showed Trevor Maxwell entering the building at 9:12 p.m. My own re-entry was recorded at 9:47. Whatever had happened in that stairwell had happened in the window before I arrived back in that building. But I had no way of knowing that when I was sitting in that interview room trying to explain 11 minutes that looked like an eternity. There was a woman, her name was Claudette, she worked in the financial compliance office on the 12th floor, who had stayed late on Wednesday evening to finish an audit. She had been working with her door open and her headphones on, and at some point around 9 o'clock she had heard voices in the east stairwell through the door at the end of her corridor. She had heard what she described as a heated exchange, one voice, male, raised and urgent, and another voice, female, that she described as frightened. She had not reported it initially because she assumed it was a personal phone call. The stairwell was sometimes used by people who wanted privacy for calls, and because she had not at that point connected it to what had happened. When she came forward, which was 4 days after the discovery of Simone's body, she gave investigators a partial account of what she had heard. The male voice, she said, had repeated a particular phrase. She couldn't make out all of it. But the part she caught was, "You humiliated me." Said not once but several times. Each time with a different inflection. The first time like a statement. The second time like a question. The third time, she said, like something else entirely. Like something past the point of asking. Let me take a moment here to tell you what it feels like to be under investigation for the death of someone you cared about. I want to be precise about this because I think it is important and because it is not something that is often described from the inside with any real accuracy. It does not feel the way it looks in films or television procedurals. It is not dramatic. It is not a series of confrontations. It is mostly a very specific kind of waiting. You go about your days, or you try to, and the investigation exists in the background of everything, like a low frequency that you cannot stop hearing even in quiet rooms. You replay conversations. You go back over every interaction you had with the person who died and you search it for things you missed, things you should have done differently, moments where a different choice might have changed the trajectory of everything that followed. You become hyper-aware of how you appear. You notice when people look at you and then look away. You notice when conversations stop as you enter a room. You notice everything and you cannot discuss any of it with anyone because the one person you might have talked to about it is the reason the investigation exists. My wife found out about the affair not from me but from a colleague who had pieced things together during the days following Simone's death, when the shape of relationships inside the office became relevant in ways they had never been before. I came home on the Tuesday of the second week to find Renee sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her and a stillness about her that I recognized as something past anger. Past hurt. Something that had already crossed over into a decision. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for an explanation. She told me that she needed me to stay somewhere else for a while and that she would be in touch about what came next. I packed a bag and I left and I drove to my brother James's house in Oakville and I sat in his guest room and I thought about all of the things I had not done when I had the chance to do them. The honesty I had not offered. The conversations I had not had. The marriage I had not fought for in the ways that actually mattered. The formal notification that I was no longer considered a primary suspect came on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks and 4 days after Simone's body was found. Detective Fontaine called my cell phone. He said the investigation had developed in a direction that had clarified my position in the timeline, and that while they would likely need me as a witness in subsequent proceedings, I was not the focus of the investigation and had not been for the previous 3 weeks. He said it in the same measured, professional voice he had used throughout, as if he were reading from a carefully prepared statement. I thanked him. He said there was no need. He said he was sorry for my loss. He ended the call. I sat in James's guest room in Oakville and I cried for a long time. Not just from relief. Though relief was there. But for Simone. For the fact of her being gone. For the 34 years of her, the sharpness of her, the humor of her, all of it simply, absent. Gone from the world without warning and without consent. And for the fact that the person who had decided she should be gone was someone who had promised to love her. Trevor Maxwell was formally arrested 7 weeks after Simone's death. The charges were significant. The physical evidence from the stairwell, the GPS records, the security footage, the testimony of Claudette from the 12th floor, the content of the final text messages, and additional digital evidence recovered from Trevor's personal devices combined to build a case that the Crown Prosecutor's Office described, in their initial filing, as substantial. Trevor was remanded into custody following a bail hearing at which the judge cited flight risk and the severity of the allegations. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf and indicated that the defense would challenge the characterization of the physical evidence. The trial was set for 14 months from the date of arrest, a timeline that is not unusual in cases of this complexity but which, for everyone involved, meant 14 more months of living inside the unresolved shape of it. I will not walk you through the entire trial in detail because some of what was presented in that courtroom belongs to people who did not consent to have their lives turned into a story, and I am aware, more than I have ever been aware of anything, of the difference between a story and a person's life. What I will tell you is that I testified. I sat in the witness box on a Thursday, the same day of the week she had been found, which I noticed and could not stop noticing, and I answered questions under oath about the nature of my relationship with Simone Maxwell. I answered them in front of her family, who sat in the third row of the gallery, and I answered them in front of strangers, and I answered them in front of a room full of people who were hearing about the most private and shameful parts of my choices laid out in documentary sequence. I told the truth. All of it. The way I told the truth in that interview room when Fontaine and Tremblay had the security footage. Complete, and too late, and permanently on the record. The cross-examination lasted just under 2 hours. The defense attorney's strategy was to introduce doubt about the timeline by suggesting that my presence in the building on Wednesday night had not been fully accounted for, that 11 minutes was sufficient time for more than retrieving a phone charger. She was skilled and she was thorough, and there were moments during the cross-examination where I could feel the room shifting, where the questions were framed in such a way that even I, who knew what I had and had not done, felt the uncertainty of my own innocence. That is the particular cruelty of being in that position. The truth does not protect you from the experience of being doubted. It only protects you from the outcome, and only if the other evidence holds. It held. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon after 3 days of jury deliberation. Guilty of second-degree murder. Trevor Maxwell was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 17 years. His sentencing judge made remarks about the calculated nature of the act, the surveillance that had preceded it, the particular cruelty of a person who responds to the end of love with violence. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. My attorney had advised me that my attendance was not necessary and that, given the media presence, it would be wise to be elsewhere. I was in a coffee shop in downtown Mississauga when I received the text from my attorney telling me the sentence had been handed down. I read it twice. I set the phone down. I sat there for a while watching people move past the window in their ordinary morning lives, carrying their coffee and their phones and their ordinary worries, and I thought about how extraordinary it is, how genuinely staggering, that the catastrophic and the mundane exist in the same world at the same time, that a sentence for murder can be delivered in the same moment that someone nearby is arguing cheerfully on a phone about a takeout order. The world does not pause. It just continues, and you either find your place back in it or you don't. I resigned from the company 4 weeks after the trial concluded. It was not required of me, I was not asked to leave, my position had technically been held during the period of the investigation and the subsequent proceedings. But I could not go back. I could not ride that elevator to the 14th floor and walk through those doors and sit in those meetings and look at those windows and not feel the weight of everything that had happened in that building. Some places become associated with what occurred in them in a way that is too complete to move past. That office was one of those places for me. I gave notice in writing, with appropriate gratitude for the tenure of my employment, and I spent the following weeks thinking very carefully about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like. My marriage to Renee did not survive. I want to address this clearly and without softening it, because it would be dishonest to imply that the investigation and the trial were the things that ended our marriage, as if they were the cause rather than the mechanism of revelation. What ended our marriage was the affair, and the years of quiet distance that had preceded it, and the choices I made in that space. Renee was generous enough, or perhaps simply exhausted enough, to have one extended conversation with me, about 3 months after the trial, in which she was honest about what she felt and I was honest about what I had done, and we both acknowledged that we had grown in different directions and that the marriage, whatever else had happened to it, had been over before either of us was willing to say so. We divorced without significant conflict. We divided what we had built together with fairness and without cruelty. She has, I understand, rebuilt her life in a way that suits her, and I am genuinely glad of that. She deserved better than what I gave her in those last years, and the least I could do, at the end of it, was to get out of her way. I want to talk for a moment about Simone. About who she was outside of this story, because this story has a way of consuming her, turning her into a role, a victim, a variable in someone else's narrative. And she was none of those things. She was a woman of 34 with a life that extended in all directions beyond the walls of that office building. She had a mother in Brampton who called her every Sunday morning. She had a best friend from her university years in London who flew to Canada for the trial and sat in that courtroom every single day. She had opinions about architecture and specific preferences about coffee and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly and changed the temperature of a room. She had plans, real, specific plans for where her career was going and what she wanted to build and who she intended to become. She had those things and then she didn't, because one person decided that his humiliation outweighed her right to continue existing. I think about that a great deal. I think about the particular arrogance of it, the monstrous self-centeredness at the center of it. The idea that a person can be ended because another person's ego demanded it. I don't have language adequate to that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I carry from all of this is not simple. It is not the clean redemption arc that stories are supposed to have, the fall, the reckoning, the rise. It is messier and quieter and more permanent than that. I carry the knowledge of the choices I made and what they contributed to, even indirectly. I carry the face of Simone's mother at the trial, and the particular quality of grief on it, not dramatic, not histrionic, just bottomless, the grief of someone who has lost a child and knows that loss is now the central fact of their remaining life. I carry the 11 minutes. I will always carry the 11 minutes. Not because I am guilty of what was suspected, but because they are a precise and unavoidable illustration of how a life can turn on a moment that feels completely unremarkable when you are living it. I took a contract position in Hamilton about 6 months after the trial. I rented a small apartment near the waterfront. I started over in the particular way that people start over when they are not entirely sure they have earned the right to, carefully, with one eye always on what they have left behind. I work in the same general field. I am good at it. I am still good at it, which is one of the strange continuities of a life that has been turned inside out. Some things survive intact that you would not have predicted would. I have been honest with myself in ways that I was not before all of this happened, which sounds like a small thing and is not a small thing. I am not the person I was at 39. I am not sure the person I was at 39 deserved to survive without being changed. I want to say something, before we close, to anyone watching this who is carrying a secret in the way that I was carrying one. Not necessarily an affair. Any secret. The kind that lives in your body as a specific physical tension, the kind you spend energy managing every single day. Secrets have a weight that accumulates. You don't notice it adding up day by day because you are so focused on keeping the structure intact that you lose sight of what the structure is costing you. And the thing about weight is that eventually it lands somewhere. Sometimes it lands on you, and that is painful but survivable. Sometimes it lands on other people, and that is something else entirely. I am not here to moralize at you. I have done enough in my own life to have forfeited any claim to moral authority over anyone else's choices. I am just telling you what I know from the inside of it, which is that the cost of a secret is always higher than it looks at the beginning, and the bill always comes due, and the only question is whether you pay it yourself or whether someone else ends up paying it for you. The office, that building, that 14th floor, those conference rooms, that east stairwell, it felt like its own world. Separate from real life. The way the office always does, with its own rhythms and its own politics and its own emotional geography. It felt sealed off from consequences. From the weight of the outside. From the full reality of the people inside it. It wasn't. It never is. The lives that people carry through those doors are complete lives, with full histories and real stakes and genuine fragility. The building does not protect you from any of it. It just gives you the illusion of a container, and containers, under enough pressure, break. Simone Maxwell was 34 years old. She was brilliant and she was funny and she had a mother who called her on Sunday mornings and plans for her life that she will never get to realize. She deserved better than the marriage she was in. She deserved better than the situation she was in with me. She deserved, above everything else, to keep living. The fact that she didn't is the center of this story, and I want to make sure it stays there, not the investigation, not my near miss with a murder charge, not the architecture of reveals and twists. The center is her. A woman who went to work on a Wednesday and did not come home. That is the story. Everything else is just what happened around it. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for sitting with the full weight of it rather than looking for the clean resolution. Stories like this one do not resolve cleanly. They resolve the way real life resolves, incompletely, with things still unfinished, with people still carrying what they carry and finding their way through the days as best they can. If this story meant something to you, if it made you feel something, think something, question something, then it has done what it was supposed to do. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, what part of this stayed with you, what you're thinking. We read every single comment. Every one. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that now, because the stories we tell here are the ones that matter, not the easy ones, not the clean ones, but the real ones, the ones that ask something of you. We will see you in the next one.